in the Depression, how the economic collapse changed our outlook on the world. The Depression challenged the fundamental American belief about itself, that it was a land of constant growth and ever-present economic abundance, and that Americans were a people of plenty, with not only a unique heritage of natural resources, but an infallible economic system. The Depression negated all that and made Americans realize that they were vulnerable and dependent on the rest of the world. The Depression, after all, was worldwide.
I have been selected.
The inauguration of Herbert Hoover, March 4th, 1929.
Of the country. I propose to do so to the extent of my own ability. But the measure of success that the government shall attain will depend upon the moral support which you, as citizens, extend. If we survey the situation of our nation, both at home and abroad, we find many satisfactions. We find some causes for concern. We have emerged from the losses of the Great War and the reconstruction following it with increased virility and strength. I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope.
We always had faith in the land, rock-bound, inviolable. But by 1929, it was apparent that something was very wrong with the country. The story began almost out of sight of most Americans, on the farms.
An advance warning of the Depression could be seen in rural America, where farmer after farmer came up against a wall of impossible economic barriers. Supply had outstripped demand, the cost of farm equipment had soared. Farms that had been in families for generations were lost.
Farmers and their families watched helplessly as they were driven from their homes. Through the 1920s, farm prices dropped 60%, taxes went up, income went down, interest and mortgage payments continued. The inevitable result was foreclosure.
Well, I think looking back, one can say that there was a stagnation in the agricultural sector throughout the period, and that the great profits were not being redistributed in a way that would maintain purchasing power. Too much of the profits were kept by the businessman or used for speculative purposes. Too little went to the workers and the farmers in a way that would keep the system going.
22. World War I had caused a crisis. Farmers had bought land and machinery to meet wartime demands. The armistice wiped out the market and brought on disaster. By 1935, 750,000 farms would be lost. Earlier in 1929, there were other danger signs. Textile workers in Gastonia, North Carolina went on strike, protesting low pay and long hours. State militia, private detectives, and angry mobs attacked the strikers. 4 workers were killed, one of them a mother of 4 children. Communists were blamed for the strike rather than a sick economy. But Gastonia was obscured by the general prosperity of the 1920s.
Life is just a bowl of cherries. Don't take it serious. It's too mysterious. You work, you save, you worry so, but you can't take your dough when you go, go, go. So keep repeating it's the berries. The strongest oak must fall. The sweet things in life to you were just loaned. So how can you lose what you've never owned? Life is just a bowl of cherries. So live and laugh at it all.
The same optimism prevailed in foreign affairs as President Hoover welcomed the delegates to the signing of the Kellogg-Briand Pact to end all wars. In Herbert Hoover, America had her first international-minded president in a decade. During the First World War, he ran a food relief program in Belgium. His name meant groceries for the starving and medicine for the sick. Hoover's work lasted 5 years, all of it voluntary. His service reinforced his strong faith in American ideals, hard work, self-reliance, enterprise. During Hoover's presidency, economic growth seemed unlimited. Paper profits on the stock market soared into the billions of dollars. During the 1920s, Americans were on a get-rich-quick binge. Increased industrial production coined profits for the country's leading industries. Higher profits raised corporate expectations and production. And the cycle accelerated at an incredible rate. And through it all, speculation in the stock market pushed prices to dizzying heights. The peak was reached on September 3rd, 1929. Then began the long slide that would end only in 1932. In one period of 5 days, $30 billion in paper profits had vanished into thin air. The Great Depression had begun, though few people knew it. At first, only a handful were unemployed. Workers suddenly jobless bought surplus apples on credit, then sold them at a profit. This was the American spirit at work. President Hoover admired their enterprise and called for more of the same.
My concern in dealing with the problems of these times has been to avert hunger or cold amongst those upon whom the blows have fallen with heartbreaking severity, that is, our unemployed workers. No one who has seen this battle as I have seen it, with the stout efforts of American faith and confidence in her people, could harbor a doubt for the future of the American people.
Garbage dumps were guarded as the new poor foraged for food.
The Depression's immediate impact on foreign policy was in economic terms. Every country in the world tried to seal itself, tried to contain the economic consequences of the Depression, tried to prevent other countries from exporting the Depression to it and thereby compounding their own troubles. So this was an era of economic nationalism, of high tariffs, the Hoover tariff, the Smoot-Hawley tariff as it was called, of 1930.
Senator Smoot and Congressman Hawley had succeeded in closing American markets to the nations that most needed them. Their tariff bill started a frantic race to get foreign imports into the United States before the trade barriers went up. President Hoover signed the bill in spite of a protest by 1,000 economists and 24 foreign nations, which in turn retaliated against American products. The resulting tariff war caused international shock waves.
The whole history, the interwar history, I think, it was very much influenced, probably basically determined, I think, by the World Depression. Certainly that's true to a certain extent in Europe, I think. It's very true in Japan. Agricultural prices fell to half of what they'd been, and half of Japan was still an agricultural country. The markets of the world began to be shut to the Japanese as countries worrying about the Depression began to put on restrictionism, not only for their countries themselves, but for their empires. And the Japanese began to see themselves really being shut out at that time. If that had not happened, much of the rest that happened, the going towards expansionism, which finally led again to a confrontation with the United States and then eventually war, I don't think that would have come.
The economic chaos of the Depression undermined the democratic government in Germany and paved the way for Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party. In America, the public blamed President Hoover for its troubles.
Hoover was called the great engineer, you know, and his administration was perhaps the best that the government had ever had. But it was lacking in Roosevelt's compassion. Every time he did something that seemed remedial, events overcame him because they were so immense.
The maintenance of a spirit of mutual self-help through voluntary giving,
to the responsibility of local government is of infinite importance to the future of America. While many are affected by the Depression, the number who are threatened with privation is but a minor percentage of our whole people. The task is not beyond the ability of community organizations to solve.
Hoover continued his theme of self-help.
He had a very clear, abstract, dogmatic view of how the economy should work. And it was essentially the old laissez-faire view, not a thoroughgoing laissez-faire view, because he was willing to have some interference with the play of market forces, but it had to be voluntary interference. If he could get the businessmen to agree not to cut wages, that was all right. But if government should try to have a minimum wage, that would be an intolerable violation of the workings of the economy. And I think this was the most important thing in his life, was this limitation on the role of the government. He was apparently quite content to let people starve, let hunger spread, just so long as the government didn't violate the proper.
War meant excitement, the ability to act, willing sacrifice, and certain knowledge that it would end. The Great Depression meant a wearing sameness day. It meant peddling papers at 4 in the morning, a farm job here, factory job there, washing dishes in restaurants. You bought and pressed your own clothes. You helped with the rent. A doctor's bill was a family crisis. Typical of millions of homes in their government, destroyed a respect for business leaders. Suddenly, America was not God's country, but as vulnerable as others. It had happened, after all, for everyone but farmers, almost as suddenly as war, and right after the greatest 10-year increase in material production in our history. America had lost its magic key to eternal prosperity.
Better, and who now found themselves in a Great Depression that was prolonged as well as vicious. This shook the confidence both of common people and of self-conscious intellectually people in their country with a curious effect. With the crises of the 30s,
Artists like Thomas Hart Benton examined their American roots in muscular and turbulent forms. Writers in the Depression turned to social criticism. John Dos Passos was a passionate polemicist on America's injustices. Edmund Wilson, the critic, embraced communism. His tract, Culture and Crisis, indicted American capitalism. Richard Wright, one of America's first great black authors, was spawned by Chicago's communist John Reed Club. Liberal causes attracted playwright Sherwood Anderson and Theodore Dreiser, who led an expedition to investigate reports of violence against Kentucky miners. Upton Sinclair, like many writers, was angered by the excesses of the American system.
Of course, this despair with capitalism, which became fairly widespread, and people thought, well, this sort of a crisis would never occur under a socialist system. This did stimulate a good deal of what you might call socialist thinking. It shook people's faith in the free enterprise system, in capitalism.
12 million unemployed brought the Communist Party into the streets. Its vocal, often violent tactics invited angry retaliation from the radical right. Congressman Martin Dies of Texas.
Our unemployment problem was transferred to the United States from foreign lands. And if we had refused admission to the 16,500,000 foreign-born in our midst, there would be no serious unemployment problem to harass us.
The Depression also led many Americans to feel that they wanted even more isolation from European society, because one view was that the Depression in America did not come because of deficiencies in the American economy, but rather that it was the virus of Europe that had spread the Depression. After all, the first closure of banks took place in Austria, in Vienna, and then there was a spread of those closures across Europe, which reached the United States a bit later. And this certainly gave many people, including Herbert Hoover, an opportunity to argue that the Depression had been brought to America because of European events. And if we could have only been more insulated from Europe, we might well not have fallen into the Depression ourselves.
The Austrian bank closing led Hoover to declare a one-year moratorium on war debts and reparations. He did not consult the French, who objected. They stalled the plan for a fatal 2 weeks. Then it was too late to restore the confidence that Hoover felt would ease the crisis.
No greater contribution can be made to economic relief today than the conclusive day-to-day demonstration that progress is being made in relieving stress and strain, which now so oppress the atmosphere of the family of nations.
Hoover's solution failed to stop the tide of European economic collapse. Germany's banks also closed. On the other side of the world, Japanese aggression went unchecked. The military had seized control of foreign policy. In January of '32, angered by a Chinese boycott of Japanese goods, Japan attacked Shanghai. For the first time on any scale, bombs fell on civilians. The world was shocked, but paralyzed by the Depression, did nothing. The end of Hooverism came during the hot summer of 1932. During June, thousands of World War veterans had been streaming into Washington. They came to lobby for a bill that proposed immediate payment of a veteran's bonus not due and payable until 1945. President Hoover opposed paying them and threatened to veto the bill. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force and camped on Washington's Anacostia Flats. The veterans brought with them their families and the despair that had plagued them for 2 years.
One of the observers at Anacostia Flats was the writer John Dos Passos. Anacostia Flats is a ghost of an army camp, he wrote. Instead of the tents and the long tar paper barracks, the men are sleeping in little lean-tos built out of old newspapers, cardboard boxes, packing crates, every kind of cockeyed makeshift shelter from the rain, scraped together out of the city dump. The doughboys have changed too. There's the same goulash of faces and dialects, foreigners' pidgin English, lingos from industrial towns and farming towns. But we were all youngsters then. Now we are getting on to middle life. Sunken eyes, hollow cheeks off bread lines. In these men's faces, as in the Pharaoh's dream, the lean years have eaten up the fat years already.
The Senate voted on the bonus as veterans waited on the Capitol steps. Their plea failed. The bill was rejected. The veterans dispersed, but 2,000 of them stayed on, hopelessly, obstinately. On July 28th, Washington police were ordered to evacuate the veterans. The White House became uneasy. President Hoover suspected a communist plot, subversion. One policeman pulled his gun and killed 2 veterans. President Hoover then ordered the Army, under General Douglas MacArthur, to oust the veterans. General MacArthur personally commanded an invasion force of cavalry tanks, a machine gun squad, and 4 infantry companies with tear gas. The veterans were confused and cheered at first. Suddenly, there was chaos. Cavalrymen rode into the crowd. Soldiers threw tear gas bombs. Women and children were trampled, and the troops scattered the veterans and their families, burning the shacks as they advanced. The ramshackle Hoovervilles were left in flames. The mission was considered a success because no one was killed. But Washington was burning that night, and Hoover's version of American individualism was dead forever.
A fundamental belief of the American people, upon which they supported an isolationist foreign policy in the 20s, was that the United States was inherently too strong for the world to challenge. This belief vanished, not as a result of war, but because of economic decay. The American people learned through the agonies of the Great Depression that foreign affairs meant something more than diplomats, armies, and treaties. The collapse of '29 was not only the most serious challenge ever presented to the face of American optimism, it was also the beginning of an awareness that the United States could not isolate herself from the world. Americans now began to ask whether it was possible for their nation to be self-sufficient, and a majority concluded it could not be. The Civil War was America's first great failure. The Depression was the second.